This is going to be Why the World's Languages Are Dying Out, an introduction to language ecology. If you've just joined us, the talk is not going to start for a couple of minutes, just to allow people to sign in. If you're signing in, perhaps you could pop a message in the chat to just let me know where you're viewing from, where you come from. That would be interesting to know. I'm going to talk about Gabon and Cameroon, so maybe there's a Gabonese or Cameroonian person there with any luck. We'll start at about 33 minutes past 11. Hope everyone's well. It's a really nice day today. That happened last year, which resulted in not as many people coming as I'd have liked, but it's nice to be outdoors and take advantage of this fine weather. And I'm sure they all caught up subsequently, so it's all good. If you've just joined, welcome to Why the World's Languages Are Dying Out. Had to remind myself of my own title just there. An introduction to language ecology, which will start in 2 minutes' time. I'm just giving people time to join. If you'd like to let me know where you're from in the chat, that would be interesting to know. I'm hoping there might be a Cameroonian person here today. That's possibly a long shot, but you never know. I'm broadcasting from Cambridge in England, fine university town, particularly pretty at this time of year with all the autumn foliage. Maybe there's autumn foliage where you are. Have to let me know. Someone from Brussels. How's autumn in Brussels? Oh, hugs and hot chocolate. Thank you. That's kind of you. Could do with at least one of those. Romania. I visited Brasov many years ago. Beautiful countryside. Bedford. I went to school in Bedford. Bedford High School, now part of Bedford Girls' School. Got a soft spot for that town. Glasgow, I've never been that far north, I'm afraid, within the United Kingdom. I've bypassed it to go to Iceland and Norway, but East Sussex, yeah, that's where my parents are from. Oh, fantastic. Leicestershire, yeah, not far from here. We'll start in 1 minute's time. I'm not going to be talking about language endangerment in Belgium today, I'm afraid, or Scotland, or anywhere in the UK. There's a slight francophone bias in my presentation, which I'll explain to you. A personage from the north of France. Hello, this is fantastic. Okay, I'm going to get started. While I'm talking, I won't be able to monitor the chat, so I won't be able to see if you write anything. Feel free to write something to another viewer in the chat if you want to. Hopefully at the end there'll be time for questions. We'll see how we go, okay? I'm going to try and share my screen now. Why the world's languages are dying out. Okay, here we go. Right. Well, hello again, everybody. I'm going to talk to you today about language ecology and specifically language endangerment. It sounds gloomy, but we will end on a happy note, I promise you. I'll take many examples from Francophone regions because when we talk about language endangerment, there's very often a colonial language involved or former colonial language. So French and the Francophone region is generally in the world is a fairly good case study. Also, this is part of a lecture course I gave on French sociolinguistics at Cambridge University a couple of years ago. There's also a disclaimer about my penultimate slide. When we talk about language endangerment, very often issues to do with race and ethnicity come up, and any opinions relating to those matters expressed in the PowerPoint are not my opinions. They're opinions of speakers who I've worked with, speakers of endangered languages. So just a bit about me quickly. This is me. I teach at Cambridge University in the Department of French and Theoretical and Applied Linguistics, and those are some of my interests. And today I'm going to talk a bit about Gabon and Cameroon, among other things. I'm going to examine these things. So what is language shift? How does it come about? What kind of factors cause language shift and death? Are there any frameworks for describing these phenomena? I like a theoretical framework. What can we do to preserve endangered languages? And grassroots initiatives, so public initiatives, are they any good? Or should governments do the work? And what do speakers think about these things? The fact being that no matter what a government or a public sort of community organization does, if the speakers themselves don't want to preserve a language, it's not going to happen. So they are the ones that hold the responsibility. Okay, why does language death matter, you might ask? Well, you probably realize it matters, otherwise you wouldn't have joined this talk. Essentially, language can hold secrets about things like medicine, ecology, weather and climate patterns. A language can give an insight into how the mind works, something we really don't understand even now in the 21st century. And in the words of David Crystal, of whom I'm a massive fan, more about, I'll recommend one of his books later, he says it's a vision of what it means to be human, which I think is so true. And in a time particularly of environmental crisis, Indigenous languages and their speakers are very, very rich sources of knowledge and wisdom. It's often said that the cure for cancer or AIDS might be in the Amazon jungle. Well, who better to unlock that cure than a speaker of an Indigenous language who has absorbed traditional cultural wisdom through that language all their lives? You also, if your language dies out, you're left in the very uncomfortable, unsettling situation of having lost your mother tongue, the language that you first conceived the world in, if you like. And that's a big thing to get your head around. Okay, not to mention the loss of diversity and the fact that for many speakers I've worked with, a language is an integral part of their identity. It's part of who they are, as is the case for these people who are protesting in the photo. And the picture at the bottom is an Australian Aboriginal man using an ancient technique to try and prevent wildfires from spreading. Okay, states of the world's languages. Now, this is a gloomy slide, I'm afraid. There are around 7,000 languages in the world. A significant proportion are endangered. And a tiny minority of those 7,000 account for about half the world's population. So about 23 languages have a global monopoly, if you like. They're spoken far more than any others. About a third of the world's languages are in Africa. Yet if you go to a language endangerment conference or multilingualism conference, you might well find no Africanists at all. And it always shocks me how little interest there is in this massive, diverse continent where all the linguistic, exciting stuff is going on. And there are grim warnings that many of these languages might disappear before the end of the century. If you want to know more about facts and figures, I would recommend these 3 websites. The Ethnologue you have to subscribe to. If you happen to be a student or attached to a university, then your library should have a subscription that will enable you to use it. Okay, so what is a language shift? First of all, I'll give you a second or two to read April McMahon's definition. She's a very interesting writer on language change, among other things. So it's essentially when you stop speaking language A, which you've always done, and you move over to language B. So that's a very watered down version of the definition. When we talk about language death and language shift, there are all sorts of rather emotive terms which are used, like language suicide, language murder, une langue glottophage, so a language which eats another language. And of course, languages are inanimate objects. They can't kill each other. Okay, and one language cannot cause the death of another one or the demise of another one. It's all about speaker decisions, speaker propensities. And incidentally, the sign on the right, I photographed at the town hall in Libreville in Gabon. And it says, kindly express yourselves in French, Gabon being an area of very high linguistic diversity. More about that in a minute. Okay. So here is Tsunoda's framework for different language shift and language death processes, some of which are more common than others. So sudden glotticide is when all the speakers are wiped out. This is very extreme, fortunately uncommon, and it might happen in a war situation, for example. In number 2, gradual glotticide, so speakers die out gradually, the language is killed off gradually, okay. In number 3, sudden language shift, this again might relate to conflict, so speakers might want to avoid being identified as relating to being a part of a particular ethnic group, such as in a case where genocide is a threat. And the most usual type of shift is gradual language shift. That's quite simply where people decide that they're not going to, more or less consciously, that they're not going to use language A as much, and they're just going to move over to language B. There may also be a kind of obsolescing stage with an intermediate phase of bilingualism, or after which the dominant language takes over, or there might be a proficiency continuum by age, typically younger people moving over to language B much more quickly than older people. And as I say, none of these things are kind of cut and dried. Okay, so and also the different processes might occur in different contexts. It depends on a mixture of factors. But number 4 is probably the most common way in which languages disappear. Different stages of language shift and death. So this is Sue Wright's classification. Again, quite self-explanatory. We begin with an unproblematic language. It's viable, everyone's using it, it's used in lots of different contexts and whatnot. But then the speech community contracts. So the language is still vigorous. It's being used a lot in a lot of different contexts, but by a lot fewer people. Okay. Things get a bit uncertain when we get to a stage where speakers are not really committed to learning the language or speaking it anymore because it's not socially advantageous. And being socially advantageous is perhaps one of the main reasons for language shift and ultimately language death in extreme cases. Obviously, when a language is contracting, that's when younger speakers are monolingual in another language, namely language B. And the typical situation is where their parents might speak to them in language A, they reply in language B. And we tend to have older speakers sticking to language A. And then once you get to stage 5, that's when you've only got very, very elderly monolinguals, or there might be no monolinguals at all, and the language could only exist in literature, in historic sources. I got carried away with transitions, I'm afraid. What causes language shift? Okay, we've got a number of factors, and as I say, you might get one of them, you might get all of them. It's very, very context dependent. What underpins language shift very often is prestige. Okay, the presence of a prestige language, which makes you lose interest in the language you've been using, and it makes you feel more attracted to a new language. So the prestige language could be an official language or a strong lingua franca. That is an indigenous language which is understood by a large proportion of the population and used perhaps for interethnic communication. So that might be a factor. Also, 2 similar variants undergoing levelling. It's also likely when a weaker language is a collection of dialects as opposed to one standardised language that's been agreed on, such as Vili in Gabon has 7 different dialects. A bit like a coalition government. Okay, the fact that doesn't have one standard could weaken it and make it more likely that people will shift away from it in time. Language policy. So this might promote monolingualism and centralisation quite overtly. There are numerous situations all around the world where that's happened historically and could be happening now. Speaker attitudes. If you feel that your language isn't cool or it's not prestigious in some way, you're not going to want to speak it in public. I came across speakers of the Nzebi language in Gabon who would often comment to me, well, there are jokes about Nzebi people and people make fun of Nzebi people. That's why I don't like speaking my language in public and I'd rather speak French. So that's a case in point, really. Another case from Gabon is the business about standardization. If you've got 4 writing systems for writing down your language, again, it's a lack of consensus which will weaken like the stronghold that your language might have in your speech community. Absence of a written tradition ties in with writing systems and whatnot, and also oral languages are particularly vulnerable. There's nothing written down, there's nothing tangible that you can refer back to with them. Education system. Now, learning a local language, an indigenous language, is sometimes seen by speakers as a soft option or drudgery. Either way, it's often not regarded as a very attractive thing to do. And in a country like Cameroon, for example, teaching the local language is still technically banned by a law that was drawn up in colonial times, still hasn't been repealed, bizarrely. The demographics of the weaker speech community, if you've got low fertility rates or you've got a very elderly population, that's going to affect language use as well, uptake of a particular language, people's attitudes towards a language too. And then we've got internal factors, which I'm going to look at quickly now, such as borrowing and convergence and things like that. So all of these are contact phenomena. Borrowing is a very familiar one. It's got a lot to do with prestige of some sort. Any language can create internally, but most just borrow for reasons of prestige, and it depends on the political will as well to create new words or not. We've got some examples of like blood, kimchi, virtuoso, epistaxis. So blood is covert prestige. It's not a high word, it's not a learned word, but it makes you look cool. It's a slang word, and you'll be part of an in-group if you use that word. Kimchi, Korean culture is very, very popular at the moment, so it's prestige, it's trendy. Virtuoso, in the early modern period when Italian was the prestige language, we imported that word. And then we've got epistaxis, a learned word, which has a non-learned cognate in the word nosebleed. So all various different sorts of contexts there. When we borrow a concept, we often don't make up a new word. We borrow the same word, like emoji, for example. We borrowed tomatoes and we took that word as well. Words come into languages through war. It's a form of contact after all. All the words under war are from Anglo-Norman. Commerce. So we borrowed a lot of words from Anglo-Norman and French, Italian as well indirectly, but English is the international language of commerce. So other languages have started borrowing from us. And colonization. So we have borrowed words from languages whose speakers colonized us and vice versa, the latter tending to be, of course, the norm. And very interestingly, I found when I was originally preparing this lecture that despite hundreds of years of colonial and commercial contact between Europeans and Africa, hardly any words have come into European languages from sub-Saharan African languages. And it makes me wonder, was it considered that concepts and ideas from that region weren't really worthwhile? Nothing was imported that was worthwhile. So words didn't come into the language in large proportions for that reason. Now, Claude Agege, the French-Tunisian linguist, he is very against borrowing, okay? And he sees it as the precursor to language death. When he refers to substitution, he's talking about relexification. That's when you end up with all your words being from another language. And that's the whole crux of borrowing as a potentially problematic early phenomenon. And when I give this lecture to students, I talk about like a sort of an iceberg or a pyramid. At the top, we've got borrowing words. Then we go down through convergence, structural change, and then code switching, broader and broader change. And then we end up with language shift at the bottom when the change has gained enough momentum. It's interesting that English has borrowed a vast amount of words and somehow maintained its integrity as a freestanding language. But anyway, convergence, so moving swiftly on to that, convergence relates to structures, okay? It doesn't always happen when languages are in contact with each other. It's dependent on many other factors. Geographical location being one of them. If you're in close geographical proximity to another language area, that could bring about structural change, not just lexical change. There's a high degree of contact, okay, and cultural influence or prestige, typically. Often a high degree of code switching, which I'll mention in a minute, or bilingualism. Convergence in literature often seems to affect younger speakers and often women, paradoxically. We'll see if we can think of why that might be in due course. Incidentally, the word Sprachbund is a concept devised in the early 20th century to distinguish between genetic and contact-induced similarities between languages. And one of the most famous Sprachbund areas is the Balkan Sprachbund, which it's affected things like future tense formation in the languages that it relates to. But there are also Sprachbund regions found in India and Southeast Asia. Incidentally, I have thrown in, I don't know if you can see on your screen, the amazing shield, the emblem of Nunavut in Canada, where there's a rampant narwhal, and there are not enough rampant narwhals in heraldry, so I always sew that in, and the slogan means "Our land, our strength" in Inuktitut. Anyway, different phases of borrowing and convergence, another theoretical framework. So this shows how borrowing can eventually get so heavy that it results in structural borrowing, not just words anymore. You start borrowing function words and then content words, and then structures begin to change. You might lose cases, your use of prepositions might change, and these are really, really crucial transformations for a language. And then, you know, it is a correlation between the strength of cultural pressure between speech communities and the extent to which structural borrowing takes place. That's something that's been noted in a number of situations where we find a language shift phenomenon in process. Code switching, where might that fit into language shift? Well, I've put Penelope Gardner-Cloros's definition of code switching there. It's often used mistakenly in media, I find at the moment, to refer to style shifting. People say they code switch when they just change their accent or maybe their vocabulary when talking to a friend as opposed to a family member or whatever. Code switching is where you actually embed elements of one language into utterances in another language. Okay, so it's discrete languages which are being used. Again, it's a contact phenomenon. It can be a feature of stable bilingualism and immigrant communities. It might involve regional minorities. It might involve native multilingual groups. Happens for many reasons. You might want to establish solidarity with the person you're talking to. You might have a vocab deficit in one language. You don't know a word in language A, use it from language B. You might want to show whether you're detached or emotive. It might relate to the status that you consider your addressee to have. There are many reasons why we do it. But essentially, when the matrix language, which is your main language, starts to take on so many embedded language elements, that's the language that you take other elements from to go into your sentence, then you could potentially get a language shift situation. Language A might eventually be completely sidelined, and you find that you're communicating in language B all the time, and we could get a language death situation there as well. It's extreme, and stable bilingualism, stable code switching situations can go on for a very long time without language shift or death happening. As I say, this process always depends on a lot of quite special combinations of factors. Another really interesting framework is Joshua Fishman's graded intergenerational disruption scale, known as the GIDS. Okay, so he devised this to describe how stable and secure a language is. The higher up in the scale, number 1, is secure. The lower down, around number 8, it's at risk. Okay, so this fairly standard thing. So it's secure when it's used by the government in higher education, in education, etc. It becomes less secure if outside your community no one really recognizes it or knows anything about it. It becomes even less secure if you get to, say, 0.6, perhaps, where it's used in informal intergenerational communication, but you start to get vertical attrition. The situation I mentioned earlier, where your parents speak to you in language A, you reply in language B, which is cooler. And then right at the bottom, we get the situation where only elderly, socially isolated speakers use the language still. Very common in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where a language or a language variety or dialect might be confined to a village, which now has a very elderly population due to ongoing urbanization and brain drain on the part of young people wanting to move to cities, to want to go away to study and things like that. Okay, and unfortunately, when speakers die off, the language will die off as well. I look at the GIDS like an inverted pyramid in terms of the extent of use. So at the top, we've got a broader extent of use, which is promoted by the government and the media and everything. And then at the bottom, we've got a very, very limited range of use indeed. If we try and apply this to Cameroon, my favorite transition, by the way, the following, we can sort of summarize the Cameroonian language situation in the following way. So just a bit of background information about Cameroon. French and English have been co-official there since 1960. It's an extremely diverse country, linguistically and ethnically. It's got about 280 indigenous languages. Nigeria has even more. And there's a policy of illusory bilingualism in Cameroon. The government would like everyone to be bilingual in French and English, but there are a lot more French speakers, a lot more French provinces, a lot more is in French than in English. The Anglophones feel marginalized. And where does that leave the local languages? Well, they don't really have any status at all. There isn't a single national language which has been promoted, an indigenous language which has been promoted to national or official status. And it's kind of the legacy of the French colonial interventionist policy, really. So if we bear in mind Fishman's framework, so in Cameroon, we can see that actually the local languages are at risk, okay? But starting at the top, if a language was secure, it would be used by the government and it would be used in the media and in education of all levels, and that's not the case. Everything is in French, pretty much, or in English in the Anglophone provinces. You might find local languages on regional TV and radio, public health broadcasting, electoral broadcasting, that kind of thing. They're not really written down. However, there's no print media in those languages. There are some regional lingua franca, so languages of sort of general communication, but French and English are a lot more common. They're ethnically neutral for a start, which helps them. Local languages are not used as a teaching medium. You wouldn't have your maths lessons in Owondo or whatever. You might be able to learn Owondo in a school, but it would be limited to areas where those languages tend to be quite widely spoken, or even monoethnic regions. And given how diverse Cameroon is, there are not many monoethnic regions at all. I found personally, working with speakers in Cameroon, that there's a huge problem of vertical attrition. And this happens, it's a very common problem in this kind of language situation where you've got very strong ex-colonial languages, and then you've got these other indigenous languages which are kind of floundering along at the bottom of the scale, really. Quite a sad anecdote, actually. I heard from a speaker of Lamso, And this ties in with point 8. So Lamso is a very, very small language spoken in Cameroon. I asked him how often he went to his village and did he have much contact with his elders? And he said, well, no, I never go to the village now because it's died out. Everybody has died. All the young people have gone to towns and the elderly people have all died. And that made me think, well, imagine if he spoke a particular dialect of Lamso, that might be restricted to that very village, in which case it's now gone and it won't have been passed on to anyone. It hasn't been written down anywhere. And I looked on the ethnologue a couple of years ago, and there was a language documented for Cameroon called Pam, which in the late 90s had 30 speakers. So it's probably got absolutely none anymore. And that quite probably corresponds to a village where that language was once spoken. It's all to do with increasing urbanization and a move away from traditional ways of life. Okay, so this is how we can apply Fishman's GIDS framework to Cameroon to see how the local languages are in rather a predicament, in fact, vis-a-vis the much stronger former colonial languages. What are the solutions, I hear you cry? Well, so under French colonial rule, it was rather different under British and German colonial rule. The French government made French compulsory in Cameroon, and pupils were punished for using the local language. It wasn't the case in the British and German colonies because Britain had a transitional mother tongue education system, which meant that you could go to school, you could be schooled in your mother tongue during primary school, and only later on would you have to do things in English. One of the biggest problems with top to bottom initiatives, so like official initiatives, is they take ages to take effect. So a law might come in 1998, and then you'll check in 2006. Well, still, it's not actually come to anything. There's still no languages being taught, teachers not being trained, inspectors not being sent to schools. It takes a very, very long time for things to get through. Also, governments have other financial priorities in Central Africa. It's unsurprising. Anyone who's ever tried to drive through the streets of Douala and experience the terrible problems of the infrastructure might understand why the government's not particularly bothered by languages and their revitalization. However, certain languages have been introduced into certain schools in certain cities, but these are big languages out of 280 odd. It doesn't leave much room for the smaller ones, which is where community initiatives come in, which I'll mention in a minute. Speakers often see these initiatives as futile anyway. They think, well, this is never going to come to anything. These languages are big languages. They don't need much help. What about ours? So it's self-perpetuating, really. I referred earlier to negative perceptions of learning a local language at school, whether it's the vehicle of education or otherwise, that is not seen as an attractive option by students. And there's evidence that in South Africa, very often mother tongue education has been seen as a kind of conspiracy to deny speakers access to English and therefore, the global market and sort of, possibilities beyond their own country, perhaps. There's also a massive disjunction, not just between legislation and action, like making laws and not actually doing anything about them, but also speakers' own views and practices. No matter what the government tells you to do, it's not going to necessarily affect what you do at home, which could be good or bad. They might say, don't speak this language. You can carry on speaking it if you want to. They might say, you must all learn these languages, and people still don't want to. In Gabon, I came across a very eminent researcher on indigenous languages whose children are monoglot francophones. So even he has not been able to persuade them that learning a local language is valuable and worthwhile. And also, of course, there's the very high level of multilingualism. We've got 280 languages. Which ones do you pick to put in the education system? So it's all a bit problematic. Not to mention that, in fact, in post-independence Guinea and Burkina Faso, to name just two countries, they withdrew French at independence and then reinstated it by popular demand. So the government made one decision, but the people actually didn't really like it and wanted French to be reintroduced again in education. So it was. Okay, non-governmental initiatives. Now, these often seem to be more popular, but it depends, again, on a number of factors. In Cameroon, there are an awful lot of community-based projects, meetings and classes you can go to. There are websites, there are little books that people create and stuff. This book, the 4,000-word French Bassa Dictionary, that was in the news when I on my last visit to Cameroon. There was just a man, an ordinary member of the public, who'd made a dictionary, and this was greeted with great excitement, as it should have been. Websites and forums, elite community members. Now, this is in our age of influencers, this is really, really relevant. So Princess Clarice of the Douala Bell family, she has been associated with, or she's helped with language promotion initiatives. She's a representative of the pre-colonial social order. And that way, she's so much more relevant to promoting local languages than a politician in a suit in an office, you know. And Sultan Njoya, this goes back a long way. So Sultan Njoya in 1896 tried to promote literacy in Bamoun. And again, a member of the pre-colonial social order. So the more people like that can be brought on board in these community initiatives, the better, I think. We've also got organizations like Propelka and Nakalko. So these organizations, they're non-governmental, and they organize literacy in a transitional method. So starting with, the mother tongue and then the indigenous language, and then working through to French or English later on. They do that. They organize these courses in a range of local languages. And then Nakalko, for example, they've got basic standardization projects going on to develop literacy within communities. And also they do teacher training, and they work very much with communities, not telling them to do things, but cooperating with them to get things done. And then we've got various TV programs that you find often on private stations and quite localized, but you do find TV programs in a number of languages, which I've put there. Now, Gabon, I did want to mention Gabon because it's very interesting. It is a language where, again, there's a lot of diversity, about 60 to 70 indigenous languages, fewer than Cameroon. But French is, again, the sole official language, and there's an increasing number of monolingual francophones. Fang is the language which has the most speakers, but it's spoken mainly in the Walloon-Tem region, which has a border with Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. I think you can just see it on the map. So it's an international language, a cross-border language, but still it's restricted to certain parts of the country, so it wouldn't really do as a national language for everybody. Something I found in Gabon and also in Cameroon is that young people especially, increasingly regard French as a Gabonese or Cameroonian language. They don't really distinguish anymore between the French and, say, Ewondo, Fang, or whatever. They have increasingly the same status in people's minds. Sole vehicle of education, a lot of governmental apathy about whether to promote local languages or not. And again, grim forecasts about the fate of the local languages in the near future. What's causing language death in Gabon? So the speakers say, well, globalization, we can't, if I speak Fang, I can go to Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon, big deal. If I speak Puno, I can't go anywhere, or maybe Congo. If I speak French or increasingly English, I can go to Europe. And that's what people's goal so often is, especially young, ambitious people at university. That's what they want to do with their futures. Political indifference, again, same problems with Cameroon. There are a lot of other priorities for governments. People perceive local languages as being very, very difficult to acquire. And actually, I think if you've been brought up speaking only French, then they probably are. They're extremely complex languages to a speaker of a European language. And also they believe that they're not suitable to technical functions, which is false. Any language can be technicalized. Any language can have new vocabulary created to meet scientific or technological needs. And additional contributing factors, a lot of the languages are not standardized. And that goes back to what I said earlier, that it weakens a language if it's not standardized. And yeah, I've noticed in Gabon fewer community efforts than in Cameroon to promote them. So there's a degree of public apathy as well. And these are this is what speakers think. I asked them, so what do you think about French still being used while there are a lot of other languages which are just declining? And opinions were very, very varied. They ranged really from acceptance through to rejection. And interestingly, the people who rejected French most vociferously were always Fang people. And the Fang culture is known in Gabon as being a very, very strong crowd culture. People are very attached to their culture and language and their province of origin, the Walloon-Tem. And they're the kind of people who people always say about the Fang, they send their children for bain linguistique, like for linguistic immersion stays to the villages, to their grandparents to make them learn about Fang. So they're the people that reject, the continuing predominance of French the most. Now, the last slide, this is where my disclaimer comes in. These are, of course, not my opinions. These are opinions which were voiced by some speakers that I spoke to in Gabon and Cameroon. And the fact is that there are, in both countries, increasingly among young people, there are very strong Western aspirations, really, really strong, actually. And European languages are seen as a route to espousing not just maybe more money, a better education, but almost a Western identity or values, which seem very aspirational to some people I've spoken to. And this, of course, is potentially a huge obstacle to language preservation and a symptom and cause at the same time of language endangerment. And it's not just in my own work that I found this. There are other authors who've worked on Cameroon who've noted they've likened these sorts of aspirations to. There was one author who likened it to skin lightening, a rejection of your actual ethnicity, your actual background. And I presented a sort of control group in Britain of English teenagers with these views, and they were actually, I think it made them feel quite sad. But why do they feel that they need to be Westerners? You know, they have their own culture. Yeah, so it's a huge obstacle to language endangerment, the measures against language endangerment, of course. I want to end, this is all gloom and doom, so I did want to end on a high note, okay? The Hualapai language, which is spoken in Arizona by the people of the tall pines, I believe. Couldn't find any pictures of pines. We've got some tall cacti. This success story of language endangerment with a grassroots initiative. So the people of the speakers of this language, people of this ethnic group, were worried, this was back in the 80s, that not enough children were learning their language. They weren't able to communicate with elders, grandparents anymore. So they decided they wanted to make a few little books for children to read. So didn't really know how to go about it, contacted a university or a college nearby, and some linguists came to their community and they helped them. And anyway, the project grew, and then the linguists took this project, and I believe some Hualapai representatives, to a conference where it was discussed. And this was quite innovative at the time, and people were quite impressed by this project. And so it went to another conference and another conference and another conference. And ultimately, indirectly, it resulted in the drawing up of the Native American Language Act in 1990. And that shows how much influence, how powerful a grassroots initiative can become, and how linguists need to work with people. They need to work with the speech community, the speakers themselves, to find out what the speech community wants and how the linguists can best sort of use their know-how to help deliver it. And there we have the gorgeous Miss Hualapai in her traditional costume. She was competing in the Miss Indian pageant in the United States, and I think she looks amazing. And there's a picture of some more folk in their traditional garb as well. And that brings me to the end. And I usually overrun. There's never time for any discussion. So thank you so much for tuning in. And here are some books if you want to learn more. Massive fan of David Crystal. So if anyone would like to read anything of his, I would recommend Language Death. Also his encyclopedia. His encyclopedia is incredible. If you only own one book on linguistics, I would make it that one. And then Mari C. Jones, a colleague of mine, for whom I wrote a chapter for that book. In fact, if you can get hold of that, that's a Cambridge University Press book about policy and planning for endangered languages. If you're attached to a university, it might be in your library, as might be the one on the right of it. And thank you so much. I think we have a couple of minutes maybe for if anyone wants to share any ideas in the chat. It's something that it's a subject that I think really sort of appeals to people, really sort of sparks people's curiosity. So if you've got anything that you'd like to share, feel free. And if you want to get in touch, my email address is on all the slides. So I'm going to try and look in the chat now without completely closing down this whole window. There we go. Online language activism, yes, using technology. I've just seen that, the first thing that came up. Absolutely. I went to last conference I went to, which was one of the Cambridge University Endangered Language Research Cluster conferences. There was someone talking about, may have been Nahuatl, about how there are various platforms being devised in Nahuatl language to increase its online presence, definitely. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you. Yes, David Crystal is awesome. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a really exciting topic. And if ever I get asked to speak at a language event, people always want to know either about sociolinguistics or language endangerment. Yeah, I'd love to contribute to it too, Ellie. Yeah, I keep thinking, what else can I do? But I think we've really got to go down the road of speech communities collaborate, asking for help from linguists if they need it, because it has to come from them. They determine whether it's the language is going to be spoken or not, ultimately. Yes. Yes, Indonesia. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly what happens in Gabon. Increasingly in Libreville, which is a very multicultural city, people intermarry, and most of my speakers who I've spoken to there haven't got parents of the same ethnicity, so they have to communicate in French. It's the lingua franca of the household, essentially. IATFL. I'm a conference in the UK. Yeah. Any other? There've been lots of messages pinging up in the chat as I've been talking. Uh, Yes, exactly, Ollie. I agree. When a country makes intentional actions to suppress practices, precisely, and we end up with this monopoly. 7,000 glorious languages and 23 account for most language use in the world. Yeah, Welsh, absolutely. Yeah, it reminds me of Libreville Town Hall, Carl, definitely. Yeah, yeah, there probably are. Endangered language projects, Ellie, always ongoing projects, really. So, yeah, I'm sure if you look on that website, then you'd be able to get in touch and make suggestions. They'd be really happy to have suggestions, I'm sure. Yeah, exactly. That's bad in Uganda. Exactly. I know. Yeah, that's very true, Windsor. So not only English is a threat, and not just in Uganda, but in many other countries in that region, that you might have a really strong local lingua franca. So you've got Lugandan Swahili. Swahili is a regional lingua franca. So yeah, that's a very interesting. I'm glad you pointed that out because you've got the little languages at the bottom, and then you've got much bigger languages, colonial ones, regional ones, and then national ones which dominated. Yeah, yeah, exactly. What can we prevent to prevent loss in variety? Mm, exactly. Be told to speak proper English. I know that's the trouble. It's a leveling. Yeah, so languages are becoming and varieties are becoming leveled. Yeah, good. What a brilliant discussion. I'm going to have to log off quite soon to free up the channel for the next speaker. It does fire people up, Gwyneth. I totally agree. Yeah. Amazing. If anyone wants to, the talk will be available online. If anyone would like slides for themselves, or if you want any of the hyperlinks, any of the links like the Endangered Languages Project, and you can't sort of access them, then I can just get in touch and I can send them to you. Okay. Okay. I'm going to have to close the my window now because I need to free up the platform for the next people to do their talks. But thank you so much for popping in and do get in touch if you'd like to. Bye. Bye.